The battlefield was a place of chaos and destruction, a planet on the brink of war, its skies filled with the sounds of clashing ships and the hum of energy weapons. Among the wreckage, one figure stood out. She was an alien warrior, tall, with sleek metallic armor that shimmered under the harsh light of the distant stars. Her name was Lyra, a battle-hardened fighter with a reputation for being unbeatable. But now, she was far from invincible. Lyra's mind, once sharp and full of strategic brilliance, was broken. Her cybernetic enhancements, which made her an unparalleled force on the field, had turned against her. The war had been brutal, and the last battle had taken its toll. The human forces, armed with technology that was as advanced as it was deadly, had outsmarted her. A critical hit to her neural network had fractured her mind, leaving her barely functional. Her body, still strong, was now nothing more than a shell, and her mind was trapped in a fog of confusion and pain. She collapsed in the middle of the battlefield, surrounded by the sounds of the war still raging around her. Her eyes flickered, trying to focus, but everything was blurry. The world seemed distant, as though it was slipping away from her. For a brief moment, she wondered if this was the end. But fate had other plans. Jack was a human soldier, one of many sent to secure the area after the battle had ended. His mission was simple: clear the wreckage, retrieve any valuable tech, and ensure there were no survivors to complicate things. He had seen many battles, but nothing like this. As he walked through the smoke-filled ruins, he stumbled upon Lyra. She lay motionless, her body still, her armor cracked, and her breathing shallow. For a moment, Jack thought she was dead. But then he saw the faintest rise and fall of her chest. Curiosity took over. Jack wasn't trained to care for the enemy, but something about Lyra's condition intrigued him. She wasn't just another soldier. Her appearance, the design of her armor, the way her body seemed to hum with power even in her broken state, it all told him she was something more. Despite her alien origins, Jack couldn't ignore the feeling that he had a chance to do something different, something beyond just following orders. Kneeling beside her, Jack inspected the damage. Her cybernetic enhancements were malfunctioning, her neural interface was fried, and her energy systems were almost depleted. She was a ticking time bomb. If he didn't do something fast, she would never make it. Jack wasn't a doctor, and he wasn't a specialist in alien technology. He was an engineer, a soldier with a knack for fixing things. His hands moved quickly, but carefully as he began to assess the damage. First, he powered down her armor to avoid further energy surges. Then, with what limited tools he had, he began the delicate task of attempting to repair her. It wasn't easy. Her systems were far beyond anything he had ever worked with before. But Jack wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He had always been the kind of person who believed that things could be fixed if you just knew where to look. Minutes stretched into hours as Jack worked, sweat beading on his forehead. Lyra's condition didn't improve much, but there was a faint sign of life. Her eyes flickered once more, though they were still clouded with confusion. Jack paused for a moment, wondering if he was wasting his time. But then he remembered the stories he'd heard about the war, about how these warriors, these aliens, had come to his planet, determined to conquer and destroy. Yet here he was, helping one of them. His thoughts were interrupted as Lyra's hand twitched. She slowly lifted it, as if reaching for something, but her movements were sluggish, disconnected. Jack's heart raced. This wasn't just a machine he was working on. This was a person, someone who had feelings, memories, and a mind of her own, even if it was lost in a haze right now. "Stay with me," Jack muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. For the first time, he realized something he hadn't considered before. He wasn't just repairing her body. He was trying to fix a mind that had been shattered. And that was something no human soldier had ever been trained for. As the hours passed and the sun began to rise over the battlefield, Jack's hope began to grow. The alien warrior, who had once been a fearsome enemy, was now a puzzle he couldn't walk away from. He didn't know what would happen when Lyra woke up, or if she ever would. But one thing was certain: He had chosen to help her, and that choice would change everything. In the quiet of the battlefield, amidst the wreckage of war, a new chapter was beginning. Not for the war between humans and aliens, but for the bond that was slowly forming between two very different people, each lost in their own way. Jack was exhausted. The work he had been doing on Lyra's cybernetic body had taken longer than expected, and the hours had blurred together. Her condition had not improved much, but there was still a flicker of hope. She hadn't slipped into a permanent coma. And for now, that was enough. He had been trying to repair her neural network, but it wasn't easy. Her systems were much more advanced than anything Jack had ever encountered. His fingers had been sore from working with tools that were too small, too precise, but it was the only thing he could do. He wiped his brow, glancing at the horizon. The battle had ended hours ago, and there was an eerie silence in the air. Jack was alone with Lyra in the middle of the battlefield, far from any human settlements or rescue teams. His mission had been to clear the area and make sure nothing dangerous was left behind, but now he found himself torn between duty and a strange sense of responsibility. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about the enemy. Lyra wasn't just another soldier to him. There was something different about her, something that made him hesitate before just leaving her behind. She had been a threat, a warrior, a piece of the larger war machine that had tried to invade his world. Yet she was here now, broken, in need of help. With the last of his energy, Jack carefully adjusted a few wires inside her damaged systems. His hands moved with a focus that only grew stronger as time passed. He wasn't a medic, and he wasn't a cybernetics expert, but he could fix things. It was what he had always done. As a soldier, as an engineer, his mind worked in patterns, finding solutions to problems that others couldn't see. His mind began to wander as he worked, thinking about the war. Humanity had always been at war with the alien forces, races from all corners of the galaxy, each with their own unique technology, their own way of fighting. He had seen the damage firsthand. The alien warriors had been ruthless, and the battles were often brutal. But there was something different about Lyra. She didn't seem like the others. She had a look in her eyes when he first found her, even in her broken state, that didn't fit the image of a cold-hearted invader. There was something human about her, something Jack couldn't quite put his finger on. A soft, strained groan broke Jack's thoughts, and his eyes snapped back to her. Lyra's eyes fluttered open, her irises still clouded and unfocused. She looked around in confusion, as if unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. Jack froze. He had expected her to wake up at some point, but it still startled him. Slowly, she turned her head, her gaze locking onto him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jack wasn't sure what to say. He had never been in a situation like this before. The alien he had been taught to hate, the one who had invaded his world, was now lying before him, alive and breathing, but so vulnerable. "Where am I?" Lyra's voice was low, shaky. It took Jack a moment to process that she was speaking to him, but when he did, he quickly answered, "You're safe. I found you after the battle." His voice was steady, though inside, he felt a whirlwind of emotions. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to protect her, but something inside him told him that she wasn't the enemy anymore. "Battle." Her voice was distant, and she stared at her hands, as if confused by their presence. She flexed her fingers slowly, testing them, and Jack could see her processing the sensation. "What happened?" I don't remember." The confusion in her voice tugged at Jack's heart. This wasn't the Lyra he had seen on the battlefield, a warrior who never hesitated, who never showed weakness. This was someone who was lost, her mind shattered, her sense of self broken. He had never considered what it might be like for one of them, an alien warrior, to feel this kind of helplessness. "You were hurt, badly," Jack said softly. "I've been working to fix you." Her eyes searched his face, trying to make sense of his words. "You fixed me." Jack nodded. "I did what I could. I don't know how long it'll take for you to feel completely better, but for now, you're alive. That's what matters." Lyra's eyes searched the space around them. She seemed to be looking for something, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar world. "I'm not dead?" she asked, the question filled with disbelief. "No, not dead," Jack replied, offering her a small smile. He couldn't explain why he felt this odd sense of pride in having saved her, but he did. It was a feeling he hadn't expected, especially given the fact that she had once been a part of the invading force. Lyra's gaze softened, and she seemed to relax, just slightly. I owe you my life." Jack wasn't sure how to respond to that. He hadn't done it for gratitude. He had done it because something inside him told him that this warrior, this broken soul, deserved more than just to be left behind. "It's no problem," Jack said, though the words felt hollow. What could he say? He had saved her, yes, but that was only the beginning. The real challenge was what would happen next. Would she remember who she had been before? Would she still see humans as enemies? And if she did, could he still help her, or would he become the one who needed saving? As Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, resting her head back against the ground, Jack realized that her journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And so was his. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the broken battlefield. The once chaotic landscape was now eerily still, the distant hum of damaged machines the only sound. Jack sat on a fallen piece of debris, taking a break from his work. His eyes kept drifting to Lyra, who was lying not far from him. Though she had regained some clarity, her expression was still one of confusion and uncertainty. The warrior, who had once commanded armies and fought countless battles, was now struggling to remember who she was. Jack had done his best to repair her cybernetic systems, but the task was far from complete. Her neural network, which had once been so efficient and deadly, was still fragile. Every now and then, he would see her fingers twitch, or her eyes would briefly focus before losing their sharpness again. It was clear that she wasn't fully herself yet, but there was a spark of life in her, something more than just the remnants of a machine. Lyra's eyes fluttered open again, and she looked around, taking in the surroundings. Her gaze eventually found Jack, and she blinked as though she was still trying to make sense of him. "I thought you would have left," she said, her voice quiet but steady. There was no anger in her words, only a kind of weary curiosity. Jack shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone." It was simple, but it felt true. Lyra studied him for a long moment. The war had taught her to trust no one, especially not humans. But here she was, relying on one for help. A small part of her, the part that had always been a warrior, felt uncomfortable with the idea. But another part, the part that felt broken and vulnerable, knew it was true. "Why?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of confusion. "Why help me? I fought against you. I was your enemy." Jack exhaled slowly, thinking about how to answer. The question was fair. Why had he helped her? Why had he chosen to spend hours trying to fix the very enemy that had been a part of the invasion? It wasn't an easy question to answer, especially for someone like him. Someone trained to fight, to win, to follow orders. "I don't know," Jack admitted. "I guess I saw you, not as an enemy, but as a person who needed help. It wasn't about who you were in the past. It's about who you are now." Lyra's expression softened, and she looked down at her hands. "And who am I now?" Her question was quiet, almost to herself. She didn't expect an answer, but Jack gave one anyway. "You're someone who deserves another chance." The silence between them stretched for a few moments, the weight of the words hanging in the air. Lyra, still lost in her own mind, couldn't quite understand what Jack meant. She had spent her life being a soldier, her purpose to fight and conquer. But now she was unsure of everything. The familiar feeling of power and certainty had slipped away, and in its place was uncertainty. Jack stood up and stretched his legs. "I need to find some supplies. You should stay here and rest." Lyra nodded slowly, though her eyes remained on him. And if the others come, the ones who fought beside me, will they come after me? Jack paused. The question was difficult. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't sure what would happen if Lyra's allies found her. The war was still going on, and enemies didn't become allies overnight. He couldn't guarantee her safety. If they do, we'll deal with it together, Jack said with more confidence than he felt. Lyra watched him leave, and for a brief moment, she thought about running. She thought about fleeing to rejoin her people, to return to the life she had known. But something stopped her. The idea of continuing the war seemed far away now. The violence and the killing. What had it all been for? She was broken, yes, but she wasn't just a weapon. She wasn't just a tool of destruction. There was more to her, she realized. There had to be. As the hours passed, Jack returned with supplies, water, food, and a few tools he had managed to salvage from the battlefield. Lyra had tried to sit up, but the effort left her exhausted. She felt weak, more so than she had ever felt before. She had been an unstoppable force on the battlefield, but now she was nothing more than a wounded, confused individual. Still, her mind was beginning to piece together fragments of memories of who she had been before the war, before the pain. "Here," Jack said as he sat beside her, handing her some water. "You need to stay hydrated." Lyra took the water gratefully, though she still felt distant, like she was watching herself from the outside. Her memories were a blur, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer the same person she had been. Whether that was a good thing or not, she wasn't sure. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice still uncertain. Jack smiled at her. "You're welcome, but you don't have to thank me." Lyra looked at him, studying his face. There was kindness in his eyes, something she hadn't expected. She had never imagined that a human soldier would treat her with compassion, let alone help her when she was weak. Jack wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. Things had changed, and somehow he believed that this was just the beginning of something new, for both of them. As the stars began to fill the sky, Lyra closed her eyes, thinking about the future. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if she could ever be the warrior she once was. But in that moment, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jack. He had continued to repair Lyra's systems, and with each passing day, her condition seemed to improve. Her eyes became clearer, her movements more controlled. She was no longer the broken, confused figure he had found on the battlefield. The warrior in her was returning, but there was something different about her now, something more human. Lyra's once cold and calculating gaze had softened. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble, and though she didn't fully understand it yet, she was beginning to feel things she had never allowed herself to feel before. There was a new awareness within her, the idea of kindness, of someone helping her without asking for anything in return, was foreign. It felt strange, but it also felt right. One morning, as Jack worked on fine-tuning the last few components of her neural system, Lyra sat up on her own. She hadn't done that in days. Her body was still weak, but her mind was growing stronger, piece by piece. She could feel the systems inside her working, the power flowing through her like electricity. It was a strange sensation, but it wasn't as uncomfortable as it had been at first. Jack looked up from his work and noticed her sitting up. He paused, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're getting better," he said, his voice warm but casual. Lyra didn't smile back, but there was a look of determination in her eyes. "How long have I been here?" she asked, her voice steady but with an edge of curiosity. "About a week," Jack replied. "You've made a lot of progress. I didn't expect you to recover this quickly." Lyra glanced down at her hands, then back at him. "I'm not sure what I'm recovering from," she said quietly. "I feel like I'm not the same person." Jack's expression softened. He could see that she was struggling with more than just her physical injuries. There was a deeper confusion, something that went beyond the shattered parts of her body. "You're not the same person," he said gently, "but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing." Lyra looked at him, her mind processing his words. She had been a soldier, a killer, a tool of war. Her purpose had been simple: follow orders, defeat the enemy, and win. Now she was trying to make sense of a life that had no clear purpose. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. "What do you think I should do now?" Lyra asked. "I can't go back to the way I was." Jack hesitated. It was a good question, one that he had been thinking about himself. She wasn't the same person who had invaded his world, but she wasn't fully human either. She was a blend of both, a warrior and a survivor. The lines between them were blurred, and Jack didn't have all the answers. What could he offer her? What kind of future could she have now? "You don't have to be who you were before," Jack said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe it's time to find out who you can be now. I know you're strong, Lyra. You've got a strength inside you that I've seen, even in your weakest moments." Lyra stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Jack's words felt like a lifeline, something to hold on to. She had always been defined by her role as a soldier. It had been the only thing she had known. But now, with that identity shattered, she felt lost. Could she really start over? Could she really find a new purpose? "I don't know what to do," she whispered, almost to herself. "I don't know who I am." "You're Lyra," Jack replied simply. "That's who you are. And that's enough." His words were like a key unlocking something inside her. She wasn't defined by her past or by the war. She wasn't just a machine or a weapon. She was something more. For the first time in a long while, Lyra allowed herself to consider the possibility of something else, something better. There was a silence between them, comfortable and filled with unspoken understanding. Jack didn't try to push her. He knew this was something she had to figure out on her own. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least she wasn't alone anymore. After a few moments, Lyra stood up. Her legs were a little unsteady at first, but she quickly regained her balance. "I think I'm ready to try again," she said, her voice steady. "Not just survive, but find a new way. Maybe I can do something good." Jack nodded, a sense of pride swelling inside him. It wasn't easy to find a new path, especially after everything Lyra had been through. But he believed in her. "Good," he said simply. "I think you'll find your way." Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the horizon. The world around them was still scared from the war, but it felt different now. There was hope. She could feel it, deep inside her. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Lyra was no longer just a product of war. She was more than that. And with Jack by her side, she was ready to find out just how much more. As the days passed, the bond between Jack and Lyra grew stronger. It wasn't just about fixing her broken systems anymore. It was about healing the parts of her that couldn't be fixed with wires and tools. And maybe, just maybe, they would both find a way to make the world a little better, one step at a time. The days seemed to stretch on, each one bringing new challenges, but also new moments of clarity. Lyra, once a cold, calculating soldier, was slowly learning what it meant to live without the weight of war hanging over her every decision. She still had the instincts of a warrior, but now, those instincts were tempered with something else, something softer, something more human. Jack had noticed the change in her. She no longer only saw the world through the lens of battle and survival. There were moments when she would stop and take in the beauty of the world around her, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of a nearby stream. These small moments, which Jack had taken for granted, were new to Lyra. The warrior within her was still there, but now it was balanced with a growing sense of curiosity about the world outside of battle. One morning, after a particularly peaceful night spent under the stars, Jack and Lyra set out to explore the nearby forest. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. It was a place Jack had visited many times, but now, with Lyra beside him, it felt different. It felt like a new beginning. "Do you miss it?" Jack asked as they walked side by side, the sun filtering through the trees above them. Lyra raised an eyebrow, her gaze focused ahead. "Miss what?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. "The war, being a soldier." Jack's question was blunt, but he didn't mean it to be harsh. He was genuinely curious about how she felt now that she had the chance to leave that life behind. Lyra thought for a moment, her mind drifting back to the life she had known, the endless battles, the missions, the constant fight for survival. It had been all she knew for so long, but now it felt like a distant memory, a life she could barely recognize. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "I miss the certainty. The purpose, it was simple. Do what you're told, fight, win, and survive. But now, everything is different." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of her words. It was easy to be a soldier, to follow orders without question. It was harder to decide who you wanted to be when there were no orders to follow, no battle to fight. "You'll find your purpose again," Jack said with quiet confidence. "It might not be the same, but it will be yours." Lyra glanced at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. It was a far cry from the uncertainty she felt inside. But she didn't say anything. She had learned to trust Jack over the past few weeks, and there was something in his words that made her believe it was possible. As they continued their walk, the sound of the forest filled the air, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, the soft crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, Lyra allowed herself to simply be in the moment, not thinking about the past or the future, but just existing. Suddenly, Jack stopped, his hand raised in a gesture for silence. Lyra, ever alert, froze beside him, her senses on high alert. She wasn't sure what Jack had heard, but the tension in the air told her something was wrong. Jack motioned for her to stay low, and Lyra followed his lead without hesitation. They crouched behind a large tree, eyes scanning the forest around them. The sound of footsteps reached their ears, heavy, purposeful, like someone was moving through the woods with intent. "Stay down," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. Lyra's heart raced, her instincts kicking in. This wasn't a moment for hesitation. She had trained for situations like this, but instead of feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline, she felt a deep calm. Jack was with her, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to face danger alone. After a few tense moments, the sound of footsteps grew fainter, and Jack stood up, signaling that it was safe to move. Lyra followed, but there was a slight smile on her face. "What is it?" Jack asked, noticing the change in her expression. "I'm starting to feel something," Lyra said, her voice still low. "A sense of peace, like I'm not just waiting for the next fight." Jack smiled back. It was the first time he had seen her like this, calm, thoughtful, and aware of the world around her, not just the next enemy. "I think that's a good sign," Jack replied. "You're moving forward, Lyra. It might be slow, but you're getting there." The two of them continued their walk, a new understanding between them. There was no enemy in sight, no immediate threat. For the first time, they were simply two people navigating a world that was still recovering from the scars of war. But in this small, peaceful moment, they found something more important than any victory: hope. As they reached the clearing, Lyra paused, looking out at the landscape before her. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. It was a beautiful sight, one she had never truly appreciated before. But now, as she stood there, she realized that it wasn't just the world that was healing. It was her too. Jack walked up beside her, and for a long moment, they stood in silence, watching the sky change. It wasn't the end of the journey, not by a long shot, but it was a beginning, a new chapter in both of their lives. And for Lyra, that was enough. She wasn't the same person she had been, and she didn't want to be, but she was ready to discover who she could become. With Jack by her side, she knew she wouldn't have to do it alone. And for the first time in a long while, She believed that the future held something better. The next few weeks felt like a strange dream to Lyra. She was living in a world where she could breathe without the constant threat of war hanging over her. Every morning, she woke up to the sounds of birds chirping and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, quiet, and unlike anything she had ever known. It felt like a new life, one she had never imagined possible. Jack continued to help her with the repairs, not just to her body, but to her mind as well. Every day, they worked together to improve the systems that kept her alive. But Jack also encouraged her to talk about her past. It wasn't easy for Lyra. Her past was filled with pain and confusion, but Jack was patient. He listened without judgment, always offering quiet encouragement, helping her to piece together the fragments of her memory. In return, Lyra began to share more of herself, little by little. She told him about the war she had been part of, about the people she had lost, about the places she had been. Each story was a small step forward, a part of the person she was becoming. And with each story, she realized that the warrior she had once been was fading into the background. The woman she was becoming was stepping into the light. One day, while they were sitting by the fire, Lyra looked at Jack with a question in her eyes. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice low and thoughtful. "I was the enemy. I was part of the reason your world was at war." Jack paused for a moment, looking into the fire. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across his face. "I don't see you as the enemy anymore," he said quietly. "You're Lyra. You're not just some soldier. You're a person, and I know that people can change. Maybe that's why I'm helping you, because I believe you can change." Lyra considered his words, her gaze lost in the flames. She had spent so long seeing herself through the lens of the war, through the cold, unfeeling lens of a soldier. To hear Jack speak of change, of the possibility of redemption, was something new. She wasn't sure if she could truly change, but the thought made her feel lighter, like a weight she hadn't realized was there had been lifted. The next morning, after another long day of repairs and shared stories, Jack suggested that they venture farther out into the forest. "We've been sticking close to camp for a while," he said. "Maybe it's time we see what else is out there. There's a village not too far from here. You might find it interesting." Lyra hesitated. The idea of venturing into the unknown, of interacting with people she didn't know, made her uneasy. But then she remembered what Jack had said. "I believe you can change." For the first time, she decided to take a step toward that change. She nodded, standing up. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "Let's see this village." The journey took most of the day. As they walked, the forest gradually began to give way to open fields, and in the distance, the first signs of civilization appeared. Lyra felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. She had seen villages before, but they had always been places of conflict, places where her people had fought to take control. But this time, things were different. She was no longer the soldier. She was an outsider, a stranger in a new world. As they entered the village, the people looked at them with curiosity. Jack had explained that they had been away from civilization for a while, and the villagers were not used to seeing strangers. But the people didn't seem afraid. Instead, they smiled and greeted Jack with respect. They had heard of him. He was known for helping others, for being a protector of the land. When the villagers saw Lyra, there was a moment of hesitation. She understood the fear in their eyes. Her appearance, her cybernetic enhancements, marked her as different. But Jack stood beside her, his presence reassuring, and slowly, the tension in the air began to fade. One of the villagers, a woman with a kind smile, approached them. "You're both welcome here," she said warmly. "It's not often we see travelers. What brings you to our village?" Lyra looked at Jack for a moment, unsure of how to respond. But Jack spoke first, his voice calm and steady. "We're just passing through," he said. "We've been traveling for a while, and we thought we'd stop and see what this place is like." The woman nodded and turned to Lyra. "And what about you?" she asked gently. "You look like you've been through a lot. We don't see many strangers around here, but everyone who passes through is treated with kindness." Lyra felt a warmth spread through her chest at the woman's words. For the first time, someone was looking at her as more than just a warrior, more than just a threat. They saw her as a person, someone deserving of kindness. "I've been through a lot," Lyra said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm trying to find a new path." The woman smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "Then you've come to the right place. We're all looking for new paths in our own ways." As the day wore on, Lyra began to relax. The villagers treated her with respect, offering food and conversation, and showing her kindness in ways she had never experienced before. It was a world so different from the one she had known. And for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could belong here. Jack watched as Lyra interacted with the villagers, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. She was changing, and he could see it now more than ever. She was no longer the cold, distant soldier. She was becoming something new, a person with a future, a person who had the chance to find peace and purpose. As night fell and the village grew quiet, Lyra stood on the edge of the village, looking out at the stars. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was finally walking towards something worth finding. The days that followed in the village felt like a dream to Lyra. She had been a part of so many different worlds, ones filled with battle, fear, and survival. But this was different. This was a place where people worked together, helped each other, and lived in peace. She had never known such tranquility before, and for the first time, she was beginning to believe it could be her new reality. Jack was by her side every step of the way. He had shown her that life wasn't about fighting, that there was more to the world than just survival. Together, they worked alongside the villagers, helping them with small tasks, fixing a broken fence, repairing tools, and planting crops. In return, the villagers offered them warmth and a place to call home, even if just for a while. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village, Lyra sat by the fire, her thoughts drifting back to the past. She had come a long way from the cold, emotionless soldier she once was. Now she was surrounded by people who accepted her for who she was, not what she had been. And it felt good. It felt like she could finally breathe. Jack sat beside her, a gentle smile on his face. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. Lyra turned to look at him. The firelight danced in his eyes, making him look more human than ever. She felt grateful for everything he had done for her, for all the patience he had shown. I'm feeling good," she said, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I didn't think this was possible. A life without fighting, without running." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes we all need to leave the past behind to move forward. It's not easy, but it's worth it. You've come a long way, Lyra." The words felt heavy, but they weren't burdensome. Lyra knew they were true. The memories of her past still lingered, but they no longer defined her. She was no longer the soldier who fought without thinking, the weapon that had been created for destruction. She was more than that. She was learning what it meant to live. A few days later, the village faced a challenge. A storm was approaching, and the villagers needed help to reinforce their homes and protect their crops. Lyra, Jack, and the others worked through the day, strengthening the walls of the houses, gathering supplies, and securing the area. It was hard work, but it felt good. For the first time, she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was working for something bigger, something worth protecting. As the storm clouds gathered in the sky, Lyra felt a sense of calm. She wasn't afraid. The work they had done together would keep them safe. And more than that, she knew she had found a place where she belonged. She was no longer the outsider, the broken machine who had been thrown into a world of conflict. She was part of something now, part of a community. The storm hit that night, fierce and wild, but the village stood strong. The houses held up, and the crops were safe. Lyra stood outside as the wind howled around her, watching the rain pour down in sheets. She felt the storm in her bones, but she also felt something else, a sense of peace, of belonging. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. Jack joined her, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. "We did it," he said, his voice warm despite the storm. "Together, we protected this place." Lyra smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes," she said, "together." In that moment, she realized just how far she had come. She had been broken, but now she was whole. Not because of the repairs Jack had made to her body, but because of the work they had done together, healing her heart, her mind, and her spirit. Jack hadn't just fixed her body. He had shown her what it meant to live again. And that was something no one else could have done. The storm passed, and the village was safe. Lyra stood with Jack by her side, looking at the stars above. There was still so much more to learn, so much more to do, but for the first time, she was ready. She was ready to live, to embrace the future that lay ahead, and to be the person she was meant to be. As they stood together, Lyra realized that the path forward wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about accepting it. It was about knowing that the person she had been, the soldier she had once been, had helped shape who she was now. And that person was stronger, kinder, and more capable of love than she had ever believed possible. Jack turned to her, his smile soft but full of meaning. "You've come so far," he said, "and I know you'll keep going." Lyra nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "With you by my side, I think I can do anything." And for the first time, she truly believed it. Together, they walked into the future, one that was filled with hope, with peace, and with the promise of a new beginning.